Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy of the People with Ben Burgess and Stefan Bertram, and I'm very, very tired.
Yeah, well, I am less tired. You know, I don't know how interesting this is to anybody. I don't actually sleep that much most nights, but it sounds like I slept more than you last night.
No, I mean, in the end, I got like 6 hours, so it just started at 5 a.m.
Okay.
and not to the chat because I was having a wild Saturday night because I was just lying in my bed with an aching ear.
Uh,
Um, but in slightly less irritating news, you wrote an essay featuring Leon Trotsky today.
yeah, I don't know. I was actually hoping for significantly less irritated news. But yeah, no, I did. So this is, the issue that the essay is about is the relationship of dialectics or the dialectical method, dialectical analysis. These might or might not all be equivalent terms to Marxist thought, and in exploring that, I talked about the views of various Marxist and Marxist-ish adjacent figures on this topic, and Trotsky features as somebody who stakes out kind of an extreme position on one end of the spectrum and of this methodological debate, right? That's really what I take it to be a debate about. That is this you know is the role of dialectics, these like categories that are inherited from Hegel to Marx, and transformed by Marx. Is this just kind of like an eccentricity of Marx's background that he was kind of intellectually reared using this terminology, so he just kind of kept using it, but it doesn't really, it doesn't really in any essential way tell us very much about the content of Marxism. That's like one end of the spectrum of views you can have about this, or is Marxism like incomprehensible without this? That this is like this sort of essential thing that that structures everything. That's the other end of the spectrum. My own view, just put cards on the table, is somewhere in between
Maybe,
those. What's that?
maybe.
Yeah, yeah, ish. uh, yeah. So yes, I do have this kind of boringly centrist view on this question, but I think I hope it becomes more interesting, as we sort of explore what the options are and why some of the standard options don't make sense. I should also say that there is going to be a follow up next week that kind of goes into a bit more detail about why I don't really buy the first of those two views that I just laid out. The sort of like this is this is just look. Well, so I actually quote in the essay the philosopher Richard Rorty, who has the sort of most extreme formulation of this view that I've ever seen from anybody in his essay "A Spectre Haunting Intellectuals" on Marx and Derrida, where he says that it's just a pity that the best political economists of the 19th century majored in philosophy in college and never quite got over it.
I,
Like
I,
so,
I didn't get that much out of this essay. I think largely due to my own condition, but that was a heater.
yeah. So Rorty's staking out the most extreme position you could take about the relationship between Marxist thought and these dialectical categories. And then so again, the one next week is going to go into a bit more detail about why I don't buy that. I think I say a couple of things in this one that sort of maybe suggest why I don't buy it. But I'm going to get much more into that next week. But what I spent much more time on talking about this week was the opposite end of the spectrum, which is Lev Davidovich Bronstein, better known as Leon Trotsky, um, who is, somebody who I read quite a bit of his stuff earlier in my life. I kind of started out politically as a socialist, as a trot, as they say. That
Happens to lots of people, not me though.
what's that?
Happens to lots of people, not me though.
Yeah, yeah, does happen to lots of people. So yeah, the socialist left is sort of swimming with people who started out that way and then kind of diverged from it in one direction or another. Um, and for that matter, lots of parts of the political spectrum other than the socialist left have their share of those people. But in any case, I mean, I'm thinking here, for example, of uh, you know, my ideological frenemy Sohrab Ahmari, who who's an ex-trot. I think he used to be in Socialist Alternative once upon a time. Um, but yeah, so I read a lot of Trotsky at one time, and Trotsky is such a good writer and is just as kind of a prose stylist, and he is very, very smart, and so it's very easy to read Trotsky and just kind of get swept up with the flow of the writing and kind of not analyze it the way that you would if you were just reading something by any other thinker. And it's like, okay, does this make sense? Does this actually follow from what he said before? Why am I supposed to believe that? And I make some effort to do more of that in this case. So and there is also this interest in kind of political context to why Trotsky is writing about this in the first place, although I think it's also kind of very confusing, right? This is something that's a big part of the, I don't know, it's kind of the mythos of Trotskyism is this faction fight where Trotsky is writing these two essays that I'm quoting in here. But also, I think kind of the more you know about it, like the more you think about it, the stranger it is that anybody in this context is arguing about dialectics at all. But
Mm.
just to I bring up Rorty and Trotsky as conceptual bookends of this methodological debate about Marx and dialectics, because Rorty has this extreme position on one end, and then Trotsky has exactly the opposite position, which is he has this famous phrase in one of these essays, Marxism without the dialectic is like a clock without a spring, which is I think a good example of the vividness of Trotsky's writing. Also, just for fun, I didn't have a chance to work this into the essay, but I remember many years ago reading a memoir called "The Prophet's Children" by a guy named Tim Woolforth, uh, who is so you may know probably one of the worst people who never held state power that the Marxist left has ever produced is a guy named Jerry Healy in the UK. I don't know if you've ever heard of him or familiar with him.
What's his flavor?
He was the founder of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, whose most famous cadre was one Vanessa Redgrave, famous for reasons other than her politics. But in any case, he was, he's something of a cult leader, basically. And in any case, the American franchise of his group was something called the Workers' League, which later turned into the Socialist Equality Party, and essentially later turned into the World Socialist website. Which
those
I'm
people.
sure you're familiar with, right? Very, very, famous kind of
We need
lefty.
to defend that American nonce, whatever his name is, the actor or the director.
Oh yeah, yeah, the Polanski.
Yeah, yeah, they're the Polanski people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Yeah, I mean, look, my own Polanski position is that he should probably be in prison, but that he should have some kind of work release program so he can continue to make movies. Since
I mean, it's all
I
too late for at the moment, isn't it? He's like 90 or something.
yeah, 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 he's very old, but yes, I do actually think I disagree with them about this. I do tend to think that he's pretty guilty, but he is, man, I love Rosemary's Baby, Chinatown, good movies. But in any case, yeah. So Woolforth was the head of the essentially American branch of this, and ended up having to fall out with Healy, and that's a lot of what the book is about. But the reason I bring it up is because there's a scene in that book where he is traveling to Cuba, and he meets this like Cuban Trotskyist who was uh, it was like a supporter of the revolution, but was still in prison for a while, and blah blah blah. And he and he introduces this Cuban Trotskyist introduces Wolfert to his children, who have these incredibly strange sounding names. And then he realizes that they're acronyms that he named his kids after the acronyms of these famous Trotsky quotes. And I remember one of them is the Marxism without dialectics is like a clock without a spring, whatever that's that makes as an acronym. That's one of this guy's kids' names. But yeah, in this, so the context of Trotsky saying this was this debate with these guys, Max Shachtman and James Burnham, and um, and this is something that I talk about this in more depth than I'm able to in this essay in a chapter of my first book, Give Them an Argument. But um, essentially, both Shachtman and Burnham would later go to the right. Burnham kind of immediately, he kind of had like a road to Damascus level political conversion like the next year. But, Shachtman in a sort of complicated way that was never quite complete. I think, that it was like sort of very slowly over the course of decades, he kind of ended up life as like a pretty mediocre sort of, you know, social democrat with shitty foreign policy views. But in any case, the fact that these guys both drifted to the right is widely taken by people in the Trotskyist tradition as vindication that they were wrong about everything, and Trotsky was right about everything in this faction fight in 1939. Since
I mean, who knows where Trotsky would have ended up if he didn't end up dead?
it's also very true, right? Yeah, I mean, and it's all very this whole game that people play with, like, read it, here's where people politically drifted later in life, therefore they were wrong in the earlier thing. It's always like very strange and selective, right? Because you always start the clock after the point where they agreed with you, right? That's the first disagreement with you is like the first sign where they that they'd started to go wrong and were inevitably going to end up as horrible reactionaries. The fact that they agreed with you was never part of the progression in that direction. But in any case, so they ended up, these people, or Burnham certainly at least, was fighting with Trotsky about two distinct issues. One of which makes sense for them to have fought about, the other of which is sort of an odd fit with the first subject, but it kind of got mixed in this debate. So the main political subject, which makes sense, is essentially the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939, which was sort of a crisis in Trotskyism because Trotsky's analysis of the Soviet Union was that it was a degenerated worker state, which roughly means that it had, it was a worker state. So it was, a worker state is supposed to be part of, a sort of a transitional form between capitalism and socialism. And it had achieved this historic breakthrough by transcending capitalist property relations. But at the same time, it had been, and that breakthrough had never been undone, even though it had been taken over by this like sort of layer of bureaucrats who, in many ways, acted like a new ruling class. But Trotsky still thought that there was like kind of a that there was sort of a redeemable socialist core to the Soviet state that could be that if there was some sort of future process in which the Stalinist bureaucrats were ousted, there was like still something salvageable there, and as such, he thought that Western socialists should have a fundamentally different attitude towards the USSR than they did towards capitalist states. That the revolution had been badly compromised, but it still needed to be defended against its many enemies. And so, essentially, in wars involving the Soviet Union, you should root for the Soviet Union, not like just kind of take a pox on both their houses attitude like you would towards wars between capitalist states. Right? That's Trotsky's position. But then the Hitler-Stalin Pact comes along, and you have this very odd spectacle of the worker state, I suppose, spreading the revolution to a bunch of Eastern European, these like Baltic states, and trying to do it in Finland, that didn't actually want them there. And so it's like, okay, so this Soviet Union is conquering these places against the will of their populations and with the diplomatic support of the Third Reich. And Shachtman and Burnham kind of balked at the idea that they should be supporting that, and this kind of led them to rethink the idea that the Soviet Union was still a degenerated worker state, as opposed to maybe being like some horrible new form of a class society. Right? That's
I mean,
roughly.
as a theoretical thing, it feels a bit strange because surely, like 18 months after they started writing stuff, they're like, "Oh, well, actually, the multi-ribbon part is over," and
Yeah, yeah,
Germany and the Soviet Union are at war, and the Baltic states like did a Nazi uprising of their own before the Germans arrived, etc., etc.
yeah. I guess by that time by that time it'd be embarrassing to say never mind. Yeah, I don't know.
Sorry, by the way, that all the artillery fire seems to be picking up on the microphone. We're celebrating the killing of Guy Fawkes at the moment here in the
Oh
UK,
yeah, yeah.
and it's been
Remember?
intense fireworks the whole day.
Yeah. Remember the 5th of November.
Yeah,
I saw that
big,
movie.
big, big parliamentary holiday.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Have a nice. Have some nice. National. Have a beautiful moment of national unity. Burn some
The,
Catholics in
the, the
effigy.
day we defeated Catholic absolutism for like the 12th time.
There you go. Uh, uh, yeah, I do have to admit, I often forget that this is a holiday over there. But um, but yeah, in any case, yeah, no, I don't know. So this is a good question. So Burnham had already had his big political switch, I guess, by the time Operation Barbarossa started. So it was sort of irrelevant to him. In
He was like, now Britain supports the Soviet Union, so I can't be friends with them either.
Yeah, I don't know what his position. I mean, presumably he just like supported the war for standard patriotic reasons at that point. In but Shachtman, I think, stuck to his guns and just sort of basically thought like World War II is just World War One again. Um, which was in a complicated way was sort of the position of the mainstream Trotskyists, except for that they had to say essentially, except for the bits of the war that are about the Soviet Union, which is kind of an interesting mental exercise, I guess, how much you can detach, it all being one big war.
Yeah.
But in any case, that's so yeah, that was what kind of sparked all of this in the first place. But then there's this totally unrelated philosophical issue that kind of got mixed up in it because in 1938, Burnham had written this essay criticizing dialectical materialism. I have actually read this. I didn't read it again for when I was writing this, but I read it when I was writing the chapter in the book. And I think I think Burnham's kind of confused. I mean, Burnham was, I think, a philosophy professor at NYU actually, but he was. I don't think. Um, I think he was like a little glib about the whole dialectics issue. I don't know, like that he had a sort of particularly, um, nuanced understanding of all this. I kind of say in the chapter of the book, look, everybody in this debate is just kind of confused. But
I
in
mean,
it,
Trotsky really seems to go to a position he had no need to go to, which we'll get to soon, I'm sure.
yeah, for sure, right? Like I actually think in a way Trotsky is even more confused than Burnham is on this, but yeah, so roughly, they, Trotsky seizes on Burnham having criticized the idea of dialectical logic or dialectical method or whatever it's supposed to be as sort of, he kind of seized on that in the context of this faction fight over geopolitics, and it's like, aha, see, that's why they're coming to the wrong political conclusions, that they're undialectical, because they've rejected the method that's at the heart of Marxist analysis, and so all of Trotsky's followers, the American SWP, have to start writing little essays about dialectics, to show that they're on the right side of this, and uh, and so Trotsky, it's actually not the one where he has the clock without a spring line. That one's the petty bourgeois opposition in the Socialist Workers Party, but he has this other essay that's like kind of more or less exclusively about this topic, called The ABCs of Materialist Dialectics. And in there, he argues in favor of, again, what, he understands as dialectical materialism, in this very strange way where he's just committed himself to things that it just seems kind of incredible to me that you'd have to be committed to say what he wants to say. But I mean, maybe this is a good time to kind of pause on all these details and just sort of back up and be like, okay, what exactly is it that we're supposed to be arguing about when we're arguing about dialectics? Because
But I'm not sure you ever did this in the essay.
not really, no. Yeah, I mean, I kind of go in sort of assuming that people, um, it's um, yeah, I do assume at least a sort of vague familiarity with with the
Yeah, but
concept.
I think kind of the problem with dialectics, especially, is that people have like a vague understanding of it, or they feel like they have quite a strong understanding, but they'll be like so far apart from what you mean and then what a third person means.
Totally, yeah. So there is a lot of, I suspect that if you took maybe even members of like exactly the same Marxist sect and interviewed them in separate rooms and asked
No
them,
consulting.
yeah, exactly, asked them to explain exactly what they meant, by dialectics, you might get some interestingly different answers, because we could say like there is, yeah, I mean, it does seem like people often mean very different things. I suspect, so this essay was inspired by a conversation with a student during the last session of my Marx Proudhon class, and one of the things I said in that discussion is I think a lot of Marxists have a bad habit of sort of attributing anything that feels kind of esoteric and profound to them to dialectics. Um,
Yeah, I mean that's how like I jokingly use the word. If there's like an
yeah.
interaction between two things and it's not really clear what the interaction is or how we could explain it, I'll just say dialectics.
Oh yeah, it's dialectical. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right. So yeah, it's very I think uh so yeah, I mean, the fact that it's so unclear is a big part of the problem. Um, probably go into some of this a little bit more next week, but roughly, you get Hegel, um, and there's a very, very long tradition leading up to Hegel, of course, that he's like pulling on different threads of, but just to just to stick with Hegel, talking about contradictions and um, in a way where like he's he's using that word in a very different way than it's used in a lot of past tradition, right? So, you know, like certainly the main thing that people mean when they use the word contradiction is like a logical contradiction. You're saying something that's inconsistent. You're saying A is true, you're also saying not A is true.
Bloody hell.
And and in but so like a contradiction is a bad thing. In Hegel's way of using the word, it's just sort of uncovering the contradictions is a matter of finding something that actually is there. That there is, so it seems to be, and there I already know that there'll be comments on this stream saying that I'm explaining this completely wrong. See above for why, but it seems to be that when Hegel, and then certainly when Marx, picking up this kind of terminology from Hegel, uses the term contradiction. Um, Sometimes it's used in a way it's a little bit more like that logical sense, but oftentimes it seems to be used to mean something more like dynamic tensions within complicated realities. And in
I think
and
especially with Marx, it feels like it's the kind of stuff which digs out the things in the structure which dig out the structure.
yeah, yeah, right. So and in particular, so oftentimes people will use this terminology, which it turns out Hegel never actually did, about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That that even so the contradiction between the thesis and the antithesis leads to the synthesis. Again, Hegel doesn't actually talk that way. Some people have found it useful as a way of thinking about it, but certainly the idea seems to be that whatever contradictions are, these are things that sort of unfold over the course of time, therefore, thereby giving rise to new things that have their own contradictions that need to be worked out, etc. So one idea that some people have had about this, kind of on the most extreme end of the spectrum, although and this seems to be some of what Trotsky has ultimately defended, is the idea that, well, because sort of standard logic from Aristotle onwards, thinks, something called contradictions are bad, they're false. And, and when Hegel and Marx, when you talk about contradictions, you're talking about these real things. Therefore, there's something called dialectical logic that's in competition with, like, I don't know, classical logic, Aristotelian logic, something like that. And these are two like competing views that they disagree with each other.
They don't,
And
they don't just disagree a little bit. They disagree on like really fundamental things.
yeah, they disagree in this absolutely fundamental way, foundational way. And sometimes people will make a move here. Trotsky, I don't quote this part, but he sort of has a couple of stabs in this direction about, like, well, okay, maybe sort of standard logic is okay for some things, the way that Newtonian physics is kind of fine if we're dealing with mid-sized dry goods, right? But you want to do the real shit, right? Then you need dialectical logic instead of standard logic. So that's one view, and there were I don't really think that there's a lot of textual evidence that Marx thought anything like that, certainly, but or Hegel for that matter.
No, it
it
just seems kind of like an unnecessary like suicide mission done
it
in
does.
service of guys who wouldn't want you to do it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. But like again, there were like Soviet like dialectical logic textbooks. People would like really try to run with this idea. Um, but yes, that seems like a very misguided idea. And then there's a lot of sort of fuzzier ideas that sort of fall a little bit short of that, but it's often unclear how far short they're trying to fall, which is like, well, okay, maybe it's not like a, you know, even though logical terminology is used, and this is a lot of what I was arguing for in the Give them an argument chapter, even though some of the same words like contradiction are being used, they're just obviously being used in these completely different ways. So
Right.
the claims that are being made with each aren't in conflict with each other. It's all completely compatible. But maybe even if it's not, a alternative logic exactly, maybe this is at least this sort of distinctive method for analyzing social reality, possibly reality in general. Engels seemed to be quite friendly to the idea of like that this applies to like everything.
Right.
Uh, the and it's this method of doing that that's just like totally different from other methods of analysis in some sense. So in the essay, I quote David Harvey, who his lectures in Capital, which I like. I think they're useful. People should listen to them. But in his lectures on Capital, there's a point in one of the early ones where I remember him sort of saying, "Well, these analytic Marxists, these G.A. Cohen types, they want to do Marxism without the dialectics, but and that's fine. But you really want to understand Marx, you have to understand dialectics. Which so far I'm okay with what everything Harvey has said, but then more or less, we can nitpick. But I think the thrust of it seems fine to me. And then he says things like, there are several points when I was listening to those lectures where he says things like, well, Marx isn't giving causal explanations; he's giving
Right.
dialectical explanations, and that really made me want to throw the phone I was listening to the lecture against the wall, because it's like, what does that mean, right? What could that even mean, right? And this idea, certainly seems to be that that somehow or another being dialectical, having this special dialectical method of analysis, sort of frees you up from having to ground your analysis in sort of standard kinds of cause and effect explanations and mechanisms, which seems also very badly misguided to me. I mean, I think if you're going to say that something is true, right? You're going to say that it happens, then I think you do actually owe it to us to have an explanation of in standard cause and effect terms of like, okay, well, but why does that happen, right? How does it work? So in all of which again might suggest you know that might suggest more sympathy than I actually have for the like Rory kind of end of the spectrum. Again, see more about that next week. But I mean, I don't like. I actually don't even really like what Cohen says about this in the introduction to the 2000 edition of Karl Marx's Theory of History, where I don't know that he's necessarily completely wrong, but I think it lacks nuance, which is a very uncharacteristic problem for a Cohen take. Usually he really gets into the like all the granular. Here are 10 things you could take this to mean, and here are the problems with 9 of them or whatever. But this, in the context, it's the introduction. He's been very quick and programmatic. And he sort of says, well, I don't think that there's this distinctive dialectical method. And it's like, okay, I don't know that I necessarily disagree with that. It depends what you mean. But like the way he puts it seems very dismissive of the idea that there's some sort of particular value to talking this way or thinking this way, or that there are maybe insights that you're more likely to be attuned to if you do, which I also think is a mistake, right? So there's the the out of what I've seen, the kind of takes I've seen about this, the one that seems sort of most plausible to me is this book, Reconstructing Marxism. I don't remember if he mentioned it when he was on our show, but one of my conversations with Tibor Rutar, he mentioned this book. So it's by Eric Olin Wright, who's like one of the classic core like analytic Marxist people. Somebody Levine, who I'm otherwise unfamiliar with, and Elliot Sober. And I was really shocked when my friend Cale Brooks recommended this book to me, before T-Bar brought it up. I was really shocked to see Elliot Sober's name on this, because he's like a big deal analytic philosopher of science who I remember hearing lots about, when I was in graduate school, and I had no idea who's even interested in Marxism, which maybe says something about the politics of that corner of academia at that time. That, it might have sort of, by then, it might have kind of been viewed as like this oddball eccentricity of his that he was interested in this, but obviously that's nothing to do with his like real contributions. But in any case, this book, Reconstructing Marxism, is, I think, a very good book. I've been working through it, and they have this, actually been doing like a, IRL reading group at a bar near where I live in LA with a couple of people going through that book. And there's a part of it where they say, so here's the quote: "Consider, for example, the idea that Marx's theory, in contrast to his rivals, is dialectical. It is notoriously unclear what this widely reported claim means. The additional assurance that Marx somehow set the dialectic on its feet hardly helps, and neither do other characterizations that commentators have preferred. Aficionados can, of course, identify and produce dialectical explanations. Arguably, Marx himself did precisely that. Moreover, it does seem that the skillful use of dialectical metaphors can serve worthwhile heuristic purposes. Other words, can help you see things you'd otherwise miss. But it is one thing to be fluent in a suggestive idiom, something else to deploy a distinctive methodology." And they go on, "This is not to say that all the specific elements traditionally subsumed under the expression Marxist method should be rejected out of hand. The point is that in order to be useful, such elements have to be translated into a language of causes, mechanisms, and effects, rather than left as elusive philosophical principles. Take the notion of a contradiction, a key element of the purported dialectical method. One way of explicating this conventional causal language is to treat a contradiction as a situation in which there are multiple conditions for the reproduction of a system, which cannot all be simultaneously satisfied. Alternatively, a contradiction can be viewed as a situation in which the unintended consequences of a strategy subvert the accomplishment of its intended goals. Or finally, a contradiction can be viewed as an underlying social antagonism that produces conflict. If a social relation has certain properties which have an intrinsic tendency to generate conflict, one might say that the conflict is generated by a contradiction. There may be advantages or disadvantages to each of these formulations. In all these cases, however, contradiction is not treated as a philosophically driven way of interpreting the essence of a process, but as a way of explicating the interactions among a set of causal mechanisms. This kind of translation of an element of Marx's method into a language of causal mechanisms is essential if the explanations generated using the elements are to be scientifically intelligible." And to me, like, I think this is the bowl of dialectics porridge that's just right. I think that, like, the way that they're handling it here, it's not just like, oh, this is just some sort of like Hegelian gobbledygook that like Marxism is better off just being cleansed from, which is certainly the Rorty view, and Cohen at his most polemical gets closer to it than I'd like, even if he's never quite there. But it's also not. This is this distinctive method of discovering the truth that is somehow different from what everybody else is doing when they're making arguments and examining evidence and trying to come up with cause and effect mechanisms and all of that stuff. Never mind that this is something that's like totally at odds with like the fundamental assumptions of standard logic, that statements can't be inconsistent and true, and things like that, right? So I'm I think I'm more or less on team Wright, Levine, and Sober on this, that kind of in between view about contradictions. And I don't that like, yes, this is this actually can be a useful way of talking, that like kind of deploying this idiom can actually help you to be more attuned to certain things, that like useful insights can come from being attuned to. But ultimately, you have to kind of find ways to translate those what you're doing into sort of standard boring, like, here's a cause and effect mechanism I'm postulating, here's my evidence for it, etc. And to at least, I don't know that I have an amazing argument to offer for, yes, this is the right way to think about dialectics, but at least by way of trying to make at least a sort of suggestive case for saying that, like, yeah, right about here is probably the conceptual territory we're best off landing in. In next week's, I'm going to talk more about why I think the sort of Rorty level dismissal is unconvincing. And then, in the other part we haven't talked about yet of this week's, I get in more to why I think that, like, the going full Trotsky is a bad idea.
Well, on full Trotsky, do you want to talk about him talking about how A is not A and going full Parmenidean? Because I actually have something I think interesting to say about it.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, so one of the very funny things about this is I don't have any particular evidence that either of them read the other, but it's I think Ayn Rand is like writing her like first novels around this time, and it is kind of amazing how much Trotsky and Ayn Rand sort of sound like each other, but with the pluses and minuses reversed. That Ayn Rand makes this nice a Democrat who loved Heidegger. What a way to summarize the man. I'm not saying you're wrong, but man, what a way to summarize the man. More interested, I suppose, than being a Democrat who loves Karl Popper or something. But in any case, that's so yeah. So Ayn Rand famously makes a really, really big deal of like saying, like, you can always kind of feel her fist pounding on the table when she says it, that A is A. And she seems to think that this is this like A is A is the sort of first.
That's how we're going to own the libtards, by pointing out.
Yeah, exactly, right? A is A, take that, libtards. Exactly. That is the sense you get from it, right? If you read like John Galt's speech at the end of Atlas Shrugged, that's, it's like, there is this suggestion that like A is A, therefore, out of selfishness is good and you should love capitalism. And I actually I remember many years ago, I had, there's somebody I used to argue with, and this is like, early Obama era, somebody I used to argue with on Facebook who was like a big Ayn Rand fan. And I remember that guy expressing confusion that in my academic work, I seem to sort of defend standard logic, but at the same time, I was a commie, and like, how could this be? Because, clearly if A is A and all that stuff, then, then you have to be a Randian. And then Trotsky, meanwhile, seems to be very concerned to deny that A is A, and to say um, that this is the sort of foundation of like the bad Aristotelian kind of logic, and rejecting it, allows you to sort of see the richer insights of kind of Hegelian logic that that he sees as the foundation of dialectical materialism, and it's and he makes just the weirdest argument against it. So he again, he's a good writer. This is all like very vivid and kind of compelling on a sentence by sentence level, but it's like you take a step back, you're like, wait, what? The so essentially says, well, okay, so if A is A, then that would mean like a pound of sugar is a pound of sugar, but really that you're going to get like from any moment to moment, you're going to get the like I don't know individual grains of sugar are going to shed from the pound, and so a pound of sugar is not actually a pound of sugar, moment to moment. And he even says, like, he sort of anticipates the obvious response to this and says, well, sophists could try to say that, a pound of sugar at a particular moment is identical to a pound of sugar at that particular moment. But actually he says, what do you mean moment? There's no such thing. There's only, if you did like an infinitesimal, interval of time, it's still undergoing change over the course of that interval. And if you're talking about, a sort of mathematical abstraction, and what he seems to mean here is like an instant, a zero duration, point in time, then there just is no such thing. And it's the weirdest thing
I mean,
because
it feels like when you argue for something online and
yeah,
then someone points out that you're really obviously wrong, but you don't want to
yeah,
admit it, so you just reach further and further into like metaphysics or whatever to try and rescue yourself.
yeah, right. Yes, it does very much have that feel. But it's like so he's doing this, he's making this argument. Like first of all, it is striking how this sort of immediate conclusion here is just frankly metaphysical, right? It's that here's a way that kind of reality of its essence, works, and so he's arguing for these metaphysical claims that he takes to be upstream of his preferred methodological conclusions, and it's like the kind of metaphysical claims he's making. I mean, ultimately, the A is an A thing seems about as obviously wrong as anything could be to me. And it's sort of the converse of the Ayn Rand problem, that it's like Ayn Rand thinks that this is true and informative, and Trotsky thinks it's false. It's just like, well, no, it's true. It's just the most mind-numbingly,
Uninteresting.
it's the most uninteresting possible truth, maybe that you could get. I mean, nothing
Well,
follows from this.
that's the interesting thing that I wanted to say. I don't know if you've
Okay.
read Stephen Tomlin's The Uses of Argument.
Now,
But he was an ordinary language philosopher from when that was a thing in the 40s and 50s, and he wrote a what was meant to be a textbook of logic, but was like really radically different to anything else that was existed at the time. Such that it got no take up at all in philosophy, but now is very very popular in like sociology and whatever.
yeah,
And he came up with the Toomlin argument form, where instead of having like minor premises, major premises, and conclusions, you have grounds, which are like kind of the datum, conclusions, which are conclusions, but then warrants, which are kind
okay,
of the rules of inference, which you get you between the grounds and the conclusions.
okay,
And in
yep,
analyzing like analytic arguments, he's like, there's something really weird going on with analytic arguments. For instance, like he gives the example of, well, he first off they're very very rare. But even if we actually like think about one that
yes.
could
So
like
what does
apply,
he mean by analytic arguments?
well, kind of like he goes through several different forms, but kind of like things which are like in some sense self-evident or syllogistic or something in this form. Like he uses the example of an argument. Um, all of Brian's sisters have red hair.
Yeah,
Anne is one of Brian's sisters, therefore
right.
Anne has red
Yep,
hair.
yep,
Um, but if you think about that argument and think about kind of in what circumstance you would ever make that sort of argument, there's literally no possible circumstance in which it's useful.
Right. That seems
Because
right. Yeah.
if the sisters aren't in front of you, then the argument doesn't actually follow. Because as Trotsky says, things change over time. As soon as the
Ugh.
sisters get out of your sight, their hair color can change. The
Uh-huh.
fact that they can have hair can change. And so on anything which isn't a particular moment, an instance in time, the argument is useless. But also, if the sisters are in front of you, surely at that point you don't need an argument to see the facts about the hair. You don't need to be looking at the other sisters to know anything about Anne's hair, and you don't need an argument about the color of Anne's hair. You just need like a finger to be pointed.
Yeah. I mean, I think this might be just kind of a particular example of the general phenomenon of arguments that are used as like illustrations in textbooks, tending to be ones that nobody would ever make because, like, what are the possible circumstances under which everybody would agree to these premises, but like the conclusion is in some kind of dispute, right? So,
No, I
like,
mean,
you're actually,
I think that's kind of the kind of move that Toomlin makes, where he's saying actually what we should be focused on in in kind of talking about arguments is arguments where the warrant isn't kind of self evident, or where the warrant actually
right.
needs backing. Because he says the strange thing about kind of things like this is it like he actually denies the idea that you don't just understand language if you fail to understand this sort of argument, but that you kind of you fail in some other way. But that
Uh,
there's not really if you present that argument and someone doesn't get it, there's not much you
uh,
can say to them apart from just like I don't know, read it again. there's not
yeah,
further facts and there's no reasons you can give. There's no backing you can give to the warrant apart from like, well, come on.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
actually, the arguments we should be focusing on are the ones which we actually use, which are ones where the warrant will need a backing,
Right.
uh, because those are the arguments that people will ever, have a problem with.
Yeah, that seems right. Um,
Spencer said a while ago, society is not a traditional logical problem.
sure.
But that's of course like also an indictment of Trotsky making this sort of argument because there was just no reason for him to do it, right?
Yeah, yeah, right. I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think that like, and there is something very funny about So I said a while ago, like we went through kind of the uh, historical context, like the actual political thing that the real argument was about, and then because Burnham had expressed this heretical view about dialectics, and Trotsky seized on it to be like, oh, that's why you guys are going wrong because you're anti-dialectics, even though Shachtman actually wasn't, but whatever, Burnham was. Um, and that this is the real problem, right? That you've rejected the dialectical method, so your analysis, it's like you've lost your guidance system. You're just flying around, every which way. Um, that, but like when he actually gets to the point in the essay where he connects the dots, right? Says, like, okay, dialectics is great. You guys are wrong for rejecting, dialectical method. Now, finally, we're back to arguing about the Soviet Union. Um, then it's kind of underwhelming, right? It's like, wait a second, you needed all of that metaphysical machinery to get this, right? That ultimately, what he's like what he says.
Well, it's kind of one of those things where when you've gotten a self-evident conclusion, you can put any bollocks in before that, and you can still get the conclusion in the end. So if you make a conclusion like it's self-evidently good to conquer Estonia because they're annoying, you can fill in whatever metaphysical stuff you wrote before then, and you can still get to the reasonable conclusion that you should invade and conquer Estonia.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I had actually did have a friend in graduate school many years ago who's from Estonia who was kind of a you know so it's a fun guy, but he was kind of a deeply strange right winger, and
Wow, shocking.
yeah, I remember, and he kind of had this like he had this way of you can kind of tell that it's like BBC World Service broadcasts. It probably helped him learn English, so like he had this way of talking that is like, well, I don't know. I always remember like him, once accusing at a party, I don't even remember what all we were arguing about, but, it was arguing with me and my friend Mark, who's been on the show a couple times over the years. And, he's like, yes, but you are just a tandem of smug fucks. So, in any case, when he actually gets back to Estonia and all that, Trotsky says the fundamental flaw of vulgar thought lies in the fact that it wishes to content itself with motionless imprints of a reality which consists of eternal motion. Dialectical thinking gives to concepts by means of closer approximations, corrections, concretization, a richness of content and flexibility. I would even say a succulence, which to a certain extent brings them closer to living phenomena. Not capitalism in general, but a given capitalism in a given state of development. Not a worker state in general, but a given worker state in a backward country in an imperialist encirclement, etc. And it's like, okay, so hold on. Ultimately, what are you saying here? Just that, things change a lot over the course of time, and it's very important not to just sort of think about them as abstractions based on the way that they might have been at one time, but to be sort of attuned to the particular characteristics that they display at a particular stage of their evolution. If so, I would say yes to all of that, right? Good advice. But did we really need all that to get here? Did we really need this sort of heavy duty metaphysical conclusions that it just seems totally wild to me to even have an opinion on from the armchair? That like, are there such a thing as zero duration instants of time or only very short intervals? Like, I don't know. Isn't that a question for theoretical physicists? And this sort of wild denial of like A being A, that like things are identical to themselves. Like, I don't think we need any of that to get to the end of the day methodological advice that he's actually trying to tie in to the immediate political debate. And this is kind of, and this is sort of ultimately where I land in the essay. It's like, okay, yes, I do think that, certainly social and political reality, is always moving and changing and evolving. So lots of other things, not everything necessarily, but lots of other things. And it is important to be aware of, kind of particular concrete, stages of development of things. It is important to be attuned even to sort of dynamic tensions within systems that can give rise to further change in the future. Like, that is a real thing about social reality that it's important to pay attention to and to take into account in your analysis of it. But none of this really seems to me to add up to anything like the idea, certainly of a dialectical logic that's different from Aristotelian logic, certainly the idea that there's this dialectical method that is just totally different from any sort of methods of figuring out what's true that would be available to regular, bourgeois theoreticians. Certainly to the idea that there's there's such a thing as a dialectical explanation of things that's different from a causal explanation and gets you off the hook of having to, postulate cause and effect mechanisms and justify them with evidence and all of that stuff. I mean, these all seem like much, much, much further claims to me, right? Like whenever people are sort of, saying reasonable things about what they mean by a dialectical method, I'm always like, yes, sure, fine. I agree with all that, right? But then they're saying, okay, therefore you see that we have this totally distinct intellectual technique that's different from anything else and maybe is even an alternative form of logic and certainly gets us off the hook of, having to do certain kind of boring methodological things other people have to do or whatever. That all just seems wrong to me. It's like, no, I don't think so, right? I don't think that you're, I think that like these kinds of even though I'm, a boring centrist on the dialectics question, I still, I think that like when you say stuff like this, you're sort of lending plausibility to the attitude of people who are inclined to just dismiss dialectics talk in general as kind of obfuscatory, mystical nonsense.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's between this and kind of the Engels thing of trying to explain everything in the universe via it, which would be it's always this thing of kind of you almost want to go like kind of Humean miracle on it.
Yeah,
Like it would be really nice if Marx, while studying kind of the political economy of England, had discovered a method which can explain everything in the universe. It seems unlikely, however.
it does. Yeah. And it's sort of as much as it would be nice. I also kind of feel like the claims about history and political economy could survive just fine without that assumption.
That's only when I went to like a Trotskyite meeting um, with Ashley Frawley,
Yeah.
and I made kind of this point, but then Ashley ganged up on me with the Trotskyites against
Oh,
me.
no. Wow. Wow. Wow, Ashley. Uh, what? Just out of curiosity, do you know which flavor of Trotskyist?
Yeah, it was. It's a socialist party in the UK.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean, I
yeah,
don't know
yeah.
how
Yep,
it
yep, yep.
translates to.
That's the
No, I mean
the,
they're
the
actually quite cool. I spent quite a lot of time with them that year, those
yeah.
years,
That's
and
the former
militant.
militant tendency, more
Yeah,
or less.
yeah. They
Yeah,
basically just do trade union stuff all the time. I
yeah,
think they're definitely the least bad Trotskyite party in the
yeah.
UK by a significant margin.
That seems
Um,
plausible. Yeah,
but yeah,
there's been a lot of got to say a lot of the history of British Trotskyism seems like an extremely weird mess.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, they seem fun.
So on next week, we're just doing this again.
Essentially, yeah,
The second half, focusing. Well, this week we've
yeah.
truly attacked dialectics. Maybe
And
um,
next week,
we're
dialectically, we're going to turn around and do
going to
the opposite.
bravely defend it. Yes,
Yes, exactly.
showing the contradiction in Stefan and Ben.
Exactly. I saw, by the way, you might not be able to pull it up because I think it's my chat, but I saw Charles Wolford saying he wanted to argue about this, but he also missed some of the stream. So watch the rest of the stream and then decide whether you want to and get in touch with me. But in any case,
I can get everything. The only thing I can't do is I can't post in your chat.
okay, I see.
So it's this kind of thing. If I want to respond to someone in your chat, it has to
You
come
have
up on
to actually
screen.
pull it up
I
on
have to
screen.
respond with my voice.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. All right. Sounds good. Well, yeah, more dialectics next week.
Hold on, let me find the outro.